Welcome, class. We've been talking a lot about textures in our first grade class, and today we're going to kind of shift our gears and start talking a little bit about storytelling, but we are still going to do some repeating in our artwork. Let's take a look. November has actually been named National American Indian Heritage Month. And even though we're not in November, we didn't get a chance to look at some artwork from Native Americans during that month. And really, it's nice that we recognize Native Americans in the month of November, and that's special that we have that month for to remember people. But I think we should remember it all the time and through all of our days of the years. So we're just going to look at it in February, and we'll learn a little bit about storytelling using Native American buffalo hides. So let's take a look. Many Northern Plains people, so Native Americans that lived on the Northern Plains, this is our United States now, and this is where the Plains people kind of lived at that time. They weren't concerned about our states and how the borders were. They were more concerned about where the animals roamed and where they could follow them and the weather at that time. So the Plains people would live all throughout this area and sometimes beyond. The Northern Plains people didn't tell their stories like we do with our books. They used to tell stories orally. So that means telling stories with their words. And sometimes they would use pictures, but because they were a people that would move around a lot, they didn't want to carry a lot of books or heavy things with them. So they would tell stories on their animal hides or their buffalo hides. So if you think about what do you think these Northern Plains people would use buffalo for? Think about that and see if you could answer that question in class. And the teacher could even pause it for you while you answered that question. So some things that I were thinking about is that we would maybe use the bones as tools, or some of their muscles they would eat. Their skins or furs could become ways to protect themselves from harsh weather, like having clothes or maybe making homes out of them. They have these strong horns that they could use for maybe weapons or other tools, and the same thing with hooves. Native Americans generally weren't the type of people that wasted things, so they tried to use all the parts of the animal, and they respected the animal for all the things that it gave them. So they weren't rude to the animals. They actually did really care for the animals and like them. But when it was time to use the fur and the meat and things like that, they would. So one of the things that they would do is they would tan the hides of the buffalo so they could be used as clothing or could be used as shelter. And so sometimes people wore buffalo hides in the winter with the fur on the inside for warmth, and the outside of the skin could be decorated then. And that's what we're going to be doing today. But you're not going to be telling their story, you're going to be telling your story. Sometimes they would use buffalo hides when people were sick, and they would paint special symbols on it to help with the healing. Sometimes political and spiritual leaders wore special hides, and that would tell stories about their being heroes or warriors, or it would even tell stories like important events that happened. And then they would use those hides almost like a book as a storytelling tool. They would look at the symbols and be able to repeat the stories kind of as reminders. So I've been using the word symbols a lot. What are symbols anyway? Maybe the teacher could pause this and you could explain what symbols are. Symbols are like an object that stands for another thing. So when you think about that, it's like a picture that stands for an idea. So think about what symbols you could name, and maybe the teacher could pause the video to see. Could you give some examples of symbols you know? They can look like all kinds of things. You could even go through here and see if you can name these symbols with your teacher. Women often wore hides that were painted with geometric patterns, so patterns that go around in a circle. And then geometric means simple shapes. Men usually wore hides that told stories in their pictures. And so this story shows a warrior returning from a raid. So today what we're going to do is we're going to combine the idea of using the geometric patterns and using a story, but we're going to tell your own story and we're going to use your symbols. We're not going to borrow from other people, but you're going to invent your own, because other people use other symbols for their ideas and you're going to use symbols for your ideas. Here's an example of a winter count. So tribal leaders usually every year would choose a single very important event of that year, and they would add a picture. And then every year, the years would go on and on and on. And every year they would retell all of the stories and then add a new one. And that would be kind of like the story of their community or their tribe. So that's another way of thinking about how they would use buffalo hides to tell some stories. So what you're going to do today is make your own buffalo hide type of story that's all about you. Again, you're using your own symbols. So in the next video, it will explain how to go about doing that and then what that's going to look like in the end.